Hi everyone, back I am with the second part of our custom attribute directive creation video. So we got to the point where it was always highlighted green. Now let's first add a functionality so that we can bind to a property inside the directive to change this color through binding it here in our, well, at the place where we attach it to an HTML element. So to do this, I first need to specify an input here, and I'm doing this by using inputs just like I used it when we were creating components. And here we also have to specify an array of all inputs we're using, and I'm just using an input called highlight color, and I will give this an alias of my highlight. Why am I doing this? Because here we're setting this directive, right? And I want to be able to bind to the property by just adding squared brackets. Now, if I would use just highlight color here and not using this alias here, well, highlight color is not the name of the selector of this directive. So I could then not bind using squared brackets because, well, Angular 2 wouldn't be able to find a property called myHighlight in the highlight directive, but that is what it would be looking for. So then in order to bind, I would have to add highlight color as an additional property binding here. So this would attach this myHighlight directive and then bind to this property. Yes, this does work, and yes, this is the way we have to do it anyway if we have multiple inputs, right? Because we can only bind one input to this. Now, well, let's do it this way now that I think about it. Let's use highlight color and do it this way here. So I want to be able to say like red here, and then, well, the green default value should be overridden and instead everything should be red. Well, that is very easy to do. First, I will obviously create the highlight color property here. So this has to match this name here, just the same as with components. And this highlight color will be of type string. Now here, when we're rendering it, I am going to either bind to this highlight color or this default color. Now with this OR operator here, that's a nice little syntactical sugar we can use to easily determine if this highlight color exists, and if yes, well then we bind to it. But if it hasn't been initialized, and by default it has not been, except for when we bind to it, well then we will use the default color. So let me save this, and as you can see it is now red because I'm binding to that. But the other example here at the bottom is still green because here I'm not attaching any binding, and therefore the default color is still applied because here we're using the OR operator. Now, as I said, I'm using the highlight color property here, and therefore I have to bind to it here. Now, if I want to use this shorter way of binding by just using the directive name itself, like this, and like we know it from ng-class and ng-style, well, to do this, I have to provide an alias here, myHighlight. And now it works again. So, really easy, I think. Let's bind this one here too by adding like blue. Okay. Now, as I said, if you would have multiple inputs we want to bind to, well, we would just specify them here in the array, use them in our code however we need to use them, and then here we would just add them like the next input and another input, right? So just like if we were binding to several properties in a component, we can to bind several properties in a directive. Now just be sure to use input names that don't interfere with other names you could bind to. Like, for example, if this wasn't a div but an image element, well, if your directive has a property called source, so src, and you want to bind to source here, that probably won't work the way you want, because the image element has an Angular 2 property called source, and therefore Angular 2 would find two things it could bind to. Probably not what you want. So be sure to pick clear and unique names there that don't interfere with anything else. That again is why we prefix it with my here. Okay, so that is how we bind to directives properties. Now let's give this the finishing touch and make sure that it only highlights if we mouse over it. Now we also do this in our directive and not with any mouse over events or anything like this on the div element. In this directive, we can provide another metadata configurator here, or configuration here, which is the host metadata. This takes a JavaScript object, and in this host data, we can basically specify which, for example, events this hosting element could fire that we want to capture in this directive. So host basically refers to our element, and in this JavaScript object we can then access various things that could happen to that element and that we want to use in our directive. Now we cannot only access events there, we can access a lot of things that are, well, connected to our hosting element. But in this case, what we're going to use is the event mouse enter. We need again the parentheses syntax here. And then in the quotation marks, I'm going to specify which method in this directive should then get executed, which will be the onMouseEnter method. And I will also do something when the mouse leaves. So the mouse leave event will also be something we want to listen to, and we will then execute the mouse leave function. So there are only two things we can do, or we can listen to in our host. So I no longer need to do it with the onInit thing, so I'm just going to comment that out, because now we're only changing the highlighting or applying it when we're mousing over it. So those events will control if we're doing something, if we're changing the style. Oops. So I'm going to get rid of this implements onInit here. And then here I have my onMouseEnter method. And in this method, I want to highlight it, and therefore I want to call this renderer setElementStyle, and then I have my reference, the background color, and again this highlight color or this default color. So that's exactly the same code as we had in the onInit method. On the onMouseLeave method here, well, we also want to call this, but we want to set the background color basically to null, which will just remove the styling. Now, since we have duplicate code here, let me just create a private function here, which I call highlight, which will get us a color in string format, and there I will copy and paste this code into this, replace this highlight color, replace this with the color we're passing into this function, and then here I'm just calling this highlight, and I'm passing this highlight color or this default color if no highlight color is set, so if we have no property binding going on. And again, I'm just going to pass this highlight null here so that we're not duplicating ourselves. So now, blue and red and blue and red. So this is working the way we want it to work. And this is how we create our own attribute directives. So as you saw, building those directives is really easy, and we have a cool way of creating reusable functionalities which we can then attach to several elements in our whole application across multiple components, totally not related to each other, but yeah, functionalities in a core that then easily to attach to various elements. Really, really cool, and as you saw, really easy to build in Angular 2. So in the next video, we will have a look at structural directives, which is the third and last form of directives we have in Angular 2. So see you in the next video. Bye.